For that 2-year period, I had the experience of working at Apple and, depending on what team you're in, your mileage just totally, there's not really a similar experience. It really depends on where you are, in the company there. So you obviously weren't at the company full time, but you were freelancing full time and you got to work on something that sounds like I'm sure it was rewarding, but also really challenging. What did you take away from those 2 years? Was there any kind of big aha moments you learned about product design, about what it means to take those mundane things and make them delightful? What nuggets did you take away that you can pass on?
Honestly, I think it was one of the greatest learning moments of my career, easily. And I think you hear that a lot, right? That's like a thing you hear from Apple. People say two things. One, I learned a tremendous amount. And two, it was incredibly punishingly a lot of work. They work you to the bone. I think it's because they tend to hire people that are really passionate and you just can't turn that off. Your work consumes you. I have a friend now and she's pretty far along in her pregnancy, but she says like, oh, like having a kid will be easy. It's my job at Apple that's hard. And it's like, it's almost tragic.
That puts it into perspective. Yeah.
It puts it into perspective. I think one of the things that really blew my mind was, and this was so different for me as a designer. I'd worked with clients large and small. Like I worked with Sony's and Mozilla's and HP's and all that stuff. And I would make a design and we'd present it to stakeholders. We would present it maybe to design directors or CEOs. And we'd be like, okay, this is the design. And people say like, okay, good. Or like, maybe we need to rethink it or something. But overall, it was a fairly normal design process with conception, idea. It was a little bit of iteration and completing. This at Apple, it was you make complete, polished, perfect designs, not concepts, not sketches, not wireframes. This was back in the day when it was basically like dimensional artwork. These were like very...
Especially Mobile Me. It was
Yes.
like, I think, the epitome of the kind of physicality that Apple had.
Physicality is a great way to put it. Yes. So we were working with materials like rendering wood and metals and all those things in the user interface. And that would be your design proposal. And we make several of those. It wouldn't just be one, like design, oh, do you like it or not? No, we'd make 10. And same thing with iconography. Like we'd make the best icons I'd ever make. And then it would go to a Steve review. And the feedback back would simply be like, no, just like the word no. And then the first time that happened to me, I can recall it really well. I was just dumbfounded. I was like, what do you mean no?
And where do you go from there? Yeah.
Yeah, I put my everything into this. I love this work. And you're like, yeah, everybody else who's already used to it just acts like it's the most normal thing in the world. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so we go back to work. And it's like, but I gave it everything and you didn't. Until now, you just didn't realize that you hadn't given it all. And the most valuable lesson to that was sometimes it's great to just, it seems like it's impossible. Sometimes it's great to just to throw it out and start over. Like that's why I made my best work. And it's also, I think, why it burns people out.
Yeah. I have to ask you a follow-up question on that as well, too. And I'm sorry, I'll get out of this rabbit hole in just a sec. But
I appreciate the rabbit hole.
I had a similar experience at Apple where I had done a lot of freelance work up until I ended up working there for 3.5 years. When I was there, a lesson that I've taken away, because I've seen no company, no design team I've been a part of has embraced deep exploration as much as Apple does. And the story that I tell people is we would work on a project, they would literally set aside the first month or 2 months, which if you're working at a startup, that sounds insane. Like if you go to a startup founder and you say, hey, we're going to take 1 to 2 months to do explorations. We're not even going to ship anything, just explorations. They would blow a gasket, but Apple would do that. And I guess the lesson I took away from it was, you knew at the end of the day, and I worked on the marketing side a lot, that what was going to end up shipping on whatever project you worked on was going to be this beautiful but kind of small iterative step forward. But to get there, Apple would make you literally blow it out. You'd look at crazy ideas, mild ideas, simple ideas, and then you take the best of those things and bring them together into the project. And anyways, it was just a totally different way of thinking, but it informs so much of how I try to think about what you need to do to actually create great work. Is that your takeaway as well, too? And for other people that maybe hear that and think it's insane, what would you say to them about why it's not insane or why that's worth doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem really wild as a process, but you can't really tangibly see the benefits of it until you go through it. And I think we see this in our day-to-day lives where we are sometimes just forced to confront resets like that. We make reconsiderations, readjustments in life. At the risk of starting to sound very philosophical, it applies to a lot of things. And it is an excellent way to get better and explore what's out there. And while it takes a lot of effort, I think what Apple shows is like people notice if you put that level of effort into something. That level of deliberation is something that is noticeable to people, even if they don't see the finer details of the
You can
design.
feel it in the
Yeah.
final design and the final execution. Yeah. Super interesting. Yeah, the way I've kind of thought about it myself, or the best way I've found to articulate it, is just that through super broad exploration. Because typically in design, you kind of do a lot of thinking, do a lot of kind of learning, do a lot of research, and then I think most of the time you hone in on a pretty narrow approach really quickly, and then you just go deep down that rabbit hole. At Apple is very different, where you stay up on the surface level for a long time. You explore this thing literally from 360 degrees. Like you're going to have to, I mean, literally, like part of the job was just sitting there being like, well, what else could I try? What else could potentially work? And that is really uncomfortable because when you're doing that, you're struggling. You're banging your head up against the wall. You know, it doesn't feel, you don't feel superhuman in that design process, but you get better work out the other side.
It's very true. Yeah, I think one of the anecdotes that I can like share by now was like we worked on like Find My Friends was like one of the apps, and I got to be honest. I mean, Steve just didn't like the concept of it, so he wasn't really on board with it from the get-go. So our job was just to make funny designs that made it less creepy. I mean, this is a different era nowadays. I actually right now have like 30 friends on Find My Friends, and there's like Zenly, and there's all sorts of like snap maps. This was before social media location sharing was really a thing. It was deeply creepy, and that's how Steve felt it was. And a lot of companies would just be like, oh, slap the default UI on it, it's fine. It was clear at Apple that we had to do something kind of wacky with the visual design to make it, I don't know, make it stand out or make it disarm users a little bit with some visual delight. And maybe we threw everything at it, Daniel. Like, I have the craziest Photoshop files on my desk still. I mean, there was some, he tried some really weird stuff. And that was, like you say, you approach it from every angle just to see what you can get. It was weird stuff, but it was very polished.